Hi grade 4, Miss Whitmore here with Decimals Lesson 2. Thanks so much for tuning in today. So what have we learned so far? So in your last video with me, we looked at the value of tenths and hundredths and how you would think hundreds would be worth more, but they're actually worth less than tenths. We also looked at the vocabulary for tenths and hundredths and the relationship between decimals and fractions. So today we're going to review the fraction to decimal relationship and vice versa. We're going to look at how to add decimals, and then we're also going to do a little bit more work on the vocabulary around decimals as well. So let's review quickly the value of tenths and hundredths. So as you move left from the decimal where there's ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, things make more sense in that 10 is smaller than 100 because 10 is only 10 things and 100 is 100 things. But when you start to move right from the decimal, it becomes the opposite because we're not talking about wholes anymore. We're talking about parts of wholes like fractions. So if we look here, 1/10 is 1 out of 10 pieces. So as you can see here, 1 out of 10 pieces is a fairly decent sized piece. When we move over here to a hundredth, which is 1 out of 100 pieces, that's a very small piece, especially because you have to compare two things that are the same size. So two same size pizzas, you're going to want to eat from the pizza that has 10 pieces, not the pizza that has 100 pieces, because they're going to be tiny. So we looked at these last class as well. So 2/10 is going to be equal to 2 out of 10 pieces. 3/10 is going to be equal to 3 out of 10 pieces. Very straightforward. Now this is the part that might get a little bit confusing. So over here to the left where we have 9/10, it's 9 out of 10 pieces. That's not overly complicated. But then when we move over here to the right where we have 10 out of 10 pieces, or 10/10, we're now talking about the entire, we'll call it a pizza again, I guess, the entire pizza, so the whole thing. So we're no longer talking about parts of a whole, we're talking about the whole thing. So this now has a value of 1. So if I ask you a question where I say in words, show me the decimal for 10/10, I would hope that you put 1.0. So how do you say these decimals? So we also looked at this last time. It's important that when you're looking at the decimals that you remember that the place value right after the decimal is your tenths, and the place value after that is hundredths. So all you do is you take the digit value and then say the place value it's in afterwards. So in this situation it's 6/10. In this one it's 7/10. In this situation we have both digits in the tenths and hundredths place value, so you might say, well, why don't I say 1/10 and 2/100ths? You could, but it's not wrong, but it's not correct. So what you want to do is you look at the last place value that's filled, which in this situation is hundredths, and then you take the total value of the digits, which is 12, and you would say 12/100ths. Okay, if there was another place value back here where there was a 3, let's say, that's the thousandths place value, you would say 123 thousandths. But we don't go that far in grade 4. In this situation we have nothing in our tenths, but we have 2 in our hundredths, so we say 2/100ths. Here again 5/100ths, and here again we have 99/100ths. So how do you say numbers that have wholes and parts? So if we look at the number 3.45. So the decimal equals the word and when you're saying it out loud. So for this number up here, you would say 3 and 45 hundredths. So let's practice a bit. In this situation, we have 12 and 43 hundredths. Here we have 167 and 89 hundredths. Here we have 4,568 and 21 hundredths. Now, if you're like me, you want to say, if we look at this question here, 167, but that's not correct. The and should only come in when you're replacing the decimal or you're describing where the decimal is. So I'm going to pause here and let you go through and practice trying to say these out loud. So don't pause the video, I'm going to pause. Okay, so if you're not finished, you can pause the video now, or you can keep following along with me because we're going to review the answers now. So were you correct? The first one was 6/10 and 7/10, 1 and 1/10, 3 and 2/100, 14 and 15/100, 99 hundredths. So hopefully you got those correct or close. All right, now we're going to move on to adding decimals. This is going to seem really overwhelming, but it's surprisingly easy. So it's basically identical to how you would normally do any type of adding, except that you now have to worry about lining up the decimals, but we've had so much practice in lining up our digits that I think you're going to do very well with this. So remember to line the decimals up, line the digits up, and then add as if you were adding a number without a decimal. Just do what you would normally do. So if you look at this first question here, you would go 4 plus 2, because we always start from the right-hand side, and that gives us 6. Then we go 5 plus 1 gives us 6. Next we have a decimal, so we're going to put a decimal point here. Then we have 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, so we get 4 and 66 hundredths as our answer. Over here we have 0 plus 4 gives us 4. 1 plus 0 gives us 1. Then we put our decimal there because that's where they line up. And then we go 5 plus 2 equals 7 to give us an answer of 7 and 14 hundredths. Now over here is where we get into regrouping. You don't change how you regroup, you do it as you would normally do, except you need to remember to have your decimal in your number. So here we go, 7 plus 5 gives us 12. So I put my 2 down here, and I put my 1 above. Then I go 1 plus 6 plus 5, which again gives me 12. So I put my 2 at the bottom here, and I put my 1 at the top. And then our decimals here line up, so we throw in our decimal, and then we go 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 4 is 7, and that gives us an answer of 7 and 22 hundredths. And finally here, we go 2 plus 6 is 8, 3 plus 9 is 12, so our 2 comes to the bottom here, and our 1 comes back up to the top. We add our decimal, then we go 1 plus 7 equals 8, 8 plus 4 equals 12, and our answer is 12 and 28 hundredths. Now, normally in school we would go over the value of these numbers that we're regrouping and we're putting up here because it is important to know. This is very complicated to do online, and I still have some other things I want to teach us. So for now, just to make sure we're kind of hitting on everything before the end of the year. This is kind of as in-depth into regrouping as we're going to go. And the last thing we need to kind of look at is subtracting decimals, which will be our next lesson. So if right now anything's confusing, it's super important that you contact me either, well, through email or the chat, and we can set something up and take like 10 minutes just to kind of straighten out some things you might be confused with. So please let me know if you need that support. If not, great. You have 3 Mathletics decimals assignments to do by the end of Friday, so please make sure you're doing that. If you still haven't done last week's decimal ones or even the fractions, please prioritize these Mathletics lessons, but make sure you're going back and doing those because those are part of my assessment for you. And you'll probably get some messages from me if they're not getting done. So have an excellent day today, guys, and thank you so much for tuning in.